Story of the body of Mussolini, it's not about fascism. I mean, it is about fascism and it's about Italy. It's more about the body of the dictator.
He ruled Italy with fierce pride and believed history would remember him as a legend. But in the end, Benito Mussolini's final moments were filled with fear, betrayal, and chaos.
Mussolini was shot by Italian partisans as he was trying to flee with his mistress into Switzerland at the end of the war. Their bodies were brought to Milan and hung upside down to prove they were dead.
How did the man who once stood beside Hitler end up hiding in disguise, begging for mercy, and facing the wrath of his own people? This is the shocking true story of Mussolini's fall, and what really happened before his execution. The rise of Eel-doo-chay. Before Benito Mussolini became one of the most infamous figures in history, he was just a young man from a small Italian town, driven by more ambition than anyone around him. He was born in 1883 in Predoppio to a blacksmith father who was a passionate socialist and a mother who worked as a schoolteacher. His father filled their home with political debates and revolutionary ideas, while his mother taught him discipline and the belief that he was meant to rise above his circumstances. That mix of confidence and defiance shaped everything he later became. As a young man, Mussolini briefly worked as a teacher, but his true gift was in words. He turned to journalism, writing bold and emotional articles that caught public attention. Italy after World War I was in turmoil. The economy was weak, jobs were hard to find, and many citizens felt betrayed by their government. Although Italy was technically on the winning side of the war, it didn't feel like victory. People were frustrated and searching for someone who could restore hope, strength, and pride. Mussolini saw that need and decided to step into that role. In 1919, he created the Fasci di Combattimento, a political group made up mostly of war veterans and disillusioned nationalists. They wore black shirts, marched through the streets, and promised to rebuild Italy's honor. Mussolini wasn't afraid to use intimidation and violence to reach his goals, but what truly distinguished him was his powerful voice. He could transform anger into energy and hopelessness into belief. To many Italians, he seemed like the one man strong enough to save the nation. By 1922, Italy was falling apart. Strikes and protests filled the cities, and politicians couldn't agree on anything. Mussolini seized the moment and called for his followers to march to Rome and demand control. The march itself wasn't a great military feat, but the image of thousands of uniformed men moving toward the capital was enough to scare the king. Instead of resisting, King Victor Emmanuel III handed power to Mussolini, hoping to prevent a civil war. At just 39 years old, Mussolini became the youngest prime minister in Italian history. From that moment, everything changed. He dismantled Italy's democracy piece by piece. Newspapers that criticized him were shut down. Opposition parties were outlawed. Schools began teaching children to praise Eel-doo-chay, the leader. His face appeared on posters, coins, and even walls of homes. For many years, he was seen as the man who made trains run on time and restored national pride. But that image couldn't last forever. The same man who once promised greatness would soon drag Italy into disaster. And before long, Mussolini's dream of a mighty empire would start to crumble, taking him down with it. Mussolini's fall and flight. By early 1945, Benito Mussolini was no longer the proud, commanding figure who once called himself Eel-doo-chay. His dream of a powerful fascist empire had completely collapsed. What had begun as a bold promise to make Italy strong again had turned into chaos, defeat, and despair. The Italian Social Republic, his last remaining government, backed only by Nazi Germany, was falling apart fast. The Allies were pushing up through northern Italy, and even his own people had turned against him. Mussolini could feel it. The war was almost over, and his time was running out. Inside his headquarters at Lake Garda, Mussolini looked tired, much older than his 61 years. Reports from the front lines were all the same, including talks of towns falling, soldiers surrendering, and Germans retreating. The Italian partisans, local fighters resisting fascism, were taking control of more and more towns. There was no way out for the man who had once ruled the country with an iron grip. By April 1945, Mussolini was surrounded by chaos. His ministers were fleeing, his guards were nervous, and even his German allies were preparing to pull out. He knew that if the Allies captured him, he would almost certainly face trial. And if the partisans found him first, his fate could be even worse. On April 25, 1945, Mussolini attended what would be one of his final meetings in Milan. It was supposed to be about peace, but the atmosphere was heavy and cold. Representatives from the Italian resistance demanded his surrender, but Mussolini refused. He still believed, at least for a moment, that he could negotiate his way out or even start over somewhere else. But by the end of that meeting, it was clear. There was no negotiation, and there was no second chance. That same day, Mussolini made a desperate choice. He would run. He decided to head north toward Lake Como, close to the Swiss border. Switzerland was neutral, and he hoped he could cross the border and seek asylum there. Maybe he could find a way to reach Spain, or even South America, where other defeated leaders were rumored to have escaped. But this wasn't just about saving himself. Mussolini refused to leave without Clara Petacci, the woman who had been by his side through everything. Clara was only 33, much younger than him, but she was deeply loyal. Her family reportedly begged her not to go with him, but she wouldn't listen. She was unwavering in her loyalty, determined to share his fate, whatever it might be. So on April 26th, Mussolini, Clara, and a small group of loyalists left Milan in a convoy of cars and trucks. They were disguised and carrying German documents. Mussolini wore a long overcoat and a steel helmet, trying to pass as a German officer. Some said he even covered his face to avoid recognition. It was a pitiful disguise for a man who once had thousands of soldiers salute him wherever he went. The roads were dangerous. Bridges were destroyed. German soldiers were retreating, and partisans were everywhere, setting up checkpoints and searching vehicles. Every few miles, Mussolini's convoy had to slow down or stop. Clara, riding beside him, kept glancing nervously out the window. The group had no clear plan. They just wanted to keep moving north, hoping to cross into Switzerland before anyone noticed who was in their convoy. At one point, Mussolini's car was nearly stopped by a group of partisans, but a German officer managed to convince them to let the convoy pass. It was a narrow escape, and it made Mussolini realize just how close danger truly was. By nightfall, the group reached a small village near Lake Como, where they rested briefly in a farmhouse. Witnesses later recalled that Mussolini barely touched his food. He looked exhausted, withdrawn. Some claimed he muttered that Italy wasn't ready for the nation he had dreamed of. Others said he sat in silence for hours. Meanwhile, in Milan, word was spreading fast that Mussolini had fled. Resistance groups sent out messages across the north, urging fighters to block all roads leading to Switzerland. The Allies were also closing in, and everyone knew Mussolini couldn't run forever. As dawn approached on April 27th, his convoy prepared to move again. The roads were foggy, the air thick with tension. German troops were retreating in long lines, their trucks loaded with weapons and supplies. Mussolini's convoy tried to blend in with them, hoping to slip through unnoticed. But luck was running out. By the afternoon, the convoy reached a small town called Dongo, near Lake Como. Partisans there were already waiting, stopping and inspecting every vehicle. It was the end of the road, and in just a few hours, the world would see how far and how fast a dictator could fall. The last night after capture. When Mussolini's convoy was stopped in the small town of Dongo, there was no gunfire or chase. The young partisans blocking the road weren't even sure who they had caught at first. It was only when they lifted the helmet off the silent man sitting stiffly in the back of a German truck that the truth became clear. The face before them was unmistakable. Benito Mussolini was finally in their hands. There was no protest or attempt to escape. Mussolini stepped out of the vehicle quietly, as if the fight had already gone out of him. One partisan later said that the man looked empty, like someone who had already accepted his fate. Clara Petacci, his companion, clung to him desperately, terrified of being separated. The partisans were stunned. For years, Mussolini had been a symbol of power and fear, the voice that echoed from balconies and radio stations across Italy. Now he stood before them in a crumpled uniform, his eyes dull and lifeless. After a brief argument about what to do, the partisans decided to move him to a nearby farmhouse under guard. The group's leaders were unsure whether to hand him to the Allies or wait for orders from higher up. For Mussolini, the uncertainty must have been crushing. He had built his life around control, yet here he was, powerless, surrounded by young men who only a few years earlier would have trembled at his name. That evening, the couple sat in separate rooms, guarded and watched closely. Clara begged to be allowed near him, telling the guards she couldn't bear to be apart. Eventually, they agreed, and she was brought to his side. The two sat together in silence, occasionally whispering, but mostly staring at the floor. Witnesses later said Mussolini hardly spoke. He seemed lost in thought, his mind perhaps racing through memories of the past 2 decades. Later that night, they were moved again, this time to a villa in the nearby village of Giulino di Mezzagra. The place was calm and quiet, surrounded by trees and a view of Lake Como. But the peace of the setting made the situation feel even more unreal. Inside, the couple was given a small room to share. The guards kept their distance, whispering to one another about what would happen next. No one seemed sure whether Mussolini would face a trial or be executed. Every rumor seemed possible, and everyone knew that decisions were being made far away, in the chaos of a collapsing Italy. Mussolini barely touched his food that night. Clara tried to convince him to eat, but he waved her off. Some said he looked pale and weak. Others said he was calm and resigned. From time to time, he stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. Maybe he was hoping for rescue, or maybe he was simply trying to picture a life that no longer existed. The man who once promised Italy glory was now a prisoner, waiting in silence. Outside the villa, the guards stayed alert. They heard occasional distant gunfire, the sound of a country still tearing itself apart, even as the war neared its end. Inside, the hours crawled by. Mussolini barely slept. Clara stayed beside him, refusing to rest, her eyes red from crying. At dawn, the guards brought him a cup of coffee. He thanked no one and stared at it blankly before setting it aside. The calm in his face was strange, almost unnatural. Around noon, he wrote a brief note stating that he had been captured by the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade and treated correctly. It was formal and polite, written like an official statement rather than a personal message. But it revealed he was trying to keep some dignity, even as the walls closed in. By late afternoon, orders arrived. The National Liberation Committee had made its decision. There would be no trial, negotiations, and no handover to the Allies. The message was simple: Mussolini's time had come. As evening fell once again over Lake Como, Mussolini and Clara sat quietly together. They didn't know that this was their final night, that within 24 hours, their story would end. The house was silent except for the footsteps of guards outside. The world beyond those walls had already decided their fate, and Mussolini was now only waiting for the inevitable: the execution. By the morning of April 28, 1945, the decision had already been made. Benito Mussolini's fate was sealed by the National Liberation Committee, which had issued a clear and brutal directive to dispose of him quickly. Italy didn't want a drawn-out trial or a spectacle. They wanted closure. For years, Mussolini had been a dictator who silenced his enemies, crushed dissent, and led his country into ruin alongside Nazi Germany. Now, the same country that once shouted "Eel-doo-chay, Eel-doo-chay" from balconies wanted him gone for good. That afternoon, the order reached Walter Audicio, a partisan commander known by his code name Valerio. Audicio was told to carry out the execution immediately. There would be no more waiting. The plan was to finish it quietly and without any chance of Mussolini escaping justice. By around 4 p.m., the convoy carrying Audicio and a small group of partisans reached the village of Giulino di Mezzagra, near Lake Como. The atmosphere was tense but strangely calm. The war was practically over, but chaos still lingered in every corner of northern Italy. Allied troops were advancing, German forces were surrendering, and partisans were taking control of towns one by one. Inside the small stone villa, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were told to get ready. They had no idea what time it was, but the moment they saw the guns, they understood. Clara reportedly clung to Mussolini, pleading with the partisans to stay by his side. Her voice was unsteady but firm. The guards hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond to the tense scene before them. Finally, Audicio gave the order that they would both face the same fate. The group led them outside, down a narrow lane toward a stone wall beside the Villa Belmonte. The afternoon sun was dipping, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Mussolini walked stiffly, his face pale but composed. When the group reached the wall, Audicio read out the official sentence. There was no trial, just a single statement that Benito Mussolini had been condemned to death for his crimes against the Italian people. The time was about 4:20 p.m. Mussolini stood facing his executioners. According to multiple accounts, he straightened his jacket and pulled open his lapels. His last words were calm and simple. "Shoot me in the chest." He wanted to face his end like a soldier, not struck from behind. Walter Audicio raised his submachine gun and fired, but the weapon jammed. For a moment, there was confusion. Then, Audicio grabbed another gun, possibly from one of his comrades, and opened fire again. Mussolini was struck and fell instantly, his body hitting the wall before sliding to the ground. Clara screamed and threw herself toward him. Without hesitation, more shots rang out, and she too fell beside him. Some accounts claim she was executed deliberately after Mussolini's death. Others say she was hit in the same volley. Either way, it ended in seconds. The courtyard fell quiet. The men lowered their weapons, and no one cheered or spoke. The air was heavy with the reality of what they had just done. The war might have been ending, but for those standing there, it felt like the closing of a wound that had bled for too long. After confirming that Mussolini was dead, the partisans quickly moved the bodies. They placed them in a truck and covered them with blankets. The plan was to transport them to Milan, where the public would finally see proof that the dictator was gone. But before that, more executions took place. In Dongo, several of Mussolini's ministers and loyalists who had been captured with him were lined up and executed that same evening. They included members of his government, military officers, and prominent fascist supporters. For years, they had served under his regime, and now they shared his downfall. By the end of the night, at least 15 had lost their lives. The bodies of Mussolini, Clara, and the others were then taken south toward Milan in the early hours of April 29th. The convoy traveled slowly, stopping occasionally at checkpoints manned by partisans who wanted to confirm the incredible news with their own eyes. Every few miles, word spread further that Mussolini was dead. Transport, display, and public desecration. Sometime around 4 a.m. on April 29th, the truck rolled into the outskirts of Milan. The war-torn city was still waking up, its streets littered with rubble, its people hungry, broken, and angry. Months earlier, Milan had suffered harsh German occupation and fascist rule. Many there had lost friends and family to political executions. The scars were raw, and the desire for closure ran deep. The partisans decided there was only one place suitable for what came next: Piazzale Loreto. For the people of Milan, that square held powerful memories. Less than a year earlier, it had been the site of one of the war's most brutal reprisals. In August 1944, 15 Italian resistance fighters had been executed there by fascist and German forces. Their bodies were placed in public view as a warning. The square had since become a symbol of defiance and grief. its name whispered with both pride and pain. Bringing Mussolini there would turn that symbol upside down, making it a final, unmistakable act of poetic justice. As dawn broke, the truck arrived at Piazzale Loreto. A few partisans stepped down and began to unload the bodies. They laid Mussolini and Petacci on the pavement, along with several other fascist officials who had been executed at Dongo. For a brief moment, the square was still. Then, as word spread through the streets, people began to gather. Within an hour, the crowd swelled from dozens to hundreds, then thousands. At first, there was disbelief more than anything else. The once feared dictator lay motionless, dressed in his dark uniform, his boots dusty from the road. But that silence quickly turned to emotion. Decades of anger, fear, and suffering erupted at once. People began shouting, crying, cursing. Some spat on the bodies and others kicked them. One woman reportedly stepped forward from the crowd, her face tight with fury. She had lost all 5 of her sons to the regime's violence. Raising a pistol, she fired in grief, shouting, "5 shots for my 5 murdered sons!" Others threw stones, shouted insults, and wept openly. It was raw, chaotic, and deeply human, and the collective outpouring of a nation scarred by years of oppression. As the hours passed, the crowd's energy grew. The bodies were pushed, jostled, and surrounded. People reached out to see Mussolini for themselves, shouting, crying, and arguing among one another. Witnesses later said his face seemed distant and unfamiliar, changed by the chaos around him. Guards tried to hold back the crowd, but the emotional wave was unstoppable. Even Clara Petacci's body, still dressed in white, was caught in the fury. By midday, the partisans realized the situation was spinning out of control. To bring order and ensure there could be no doubt about what had happened, they decided to display the bodies where everyone could see them. Using ropes and iron hooks, they suspended Mussolini, Petacci, and several of his closest allies from a metal beam above a service station on the edge of the square. It was a shocking sight, but one meant to serve a clear purpose. As proof of death, a symbolic reversal of the terror Mussolini had once unleashed, and a form of national catharsis. From the surrounding streets, thousands of Milanese poured into the square. The noise was constant, with shouts, sobs, jeers, and the whirring of cameras. Allied journalists and soldiers who arrived later that day captured the scene in photographs that would soon circle the world. For the first time in decades, Italians could see their former dictator powerless and gone. The decision to display the bodies in this way was controversial, even among the partisans. Some argued it was undignified and unnecessary. Others believed it was the only way to prevent rumors that Mussolini had escaped or been hidden away. Whatever the motive, the image left an indelible mark on history. Throughout the afternoon, people continued to pour in. Many came simply to witness what they had dreamed of for years. The bodies hung for hours, battered by both the elements and the emotions of a wounded nation. Soldiers tried to maintain order, but the crowd was too large, too charged with history. By evening, the Committee of National Liberation ordered the display to end. The bodies were carefully taken down, though they had already been photographed countless times. What remained of Mussolini and Petacci was moved to a nearby garage under construction at the edge of the square to await official examination and burial. The crowd slowly began to thin, the energy giving way to a strange, uneasy quiet. That night, the city of Milan settled under a heavy silence. The square that had once been a place of terror was now a place of grim triumph. People gathered in small groups, talking about what they had seen, still half in disbelief. Mussolini's death had closed a dark chapter, but it also left behind a haunting question. How could one man have held so much power and brought so much destruction for so long? By morning, the world knew the news. Newspapers from London to New York carried the same photographs from Piazzale Loreto. And though Italy would spend years trying to rebuild its dignity and unity, that day in Milan would forever be the moment the nation finally broke free from its dictator's shadow. Aftermath and legacy. When the chaos in Milan finally quieted, the authorities were left with a delicate question: what to do with Mussolini's remains? The Committee of National Liberation ordered the bodies removed from Piazzale Loreto and taken for examination. Soon after, Mussolini was buried in a simple, unmarked grave in a Milan cemetery. The secrecy around the burial was intentional, as the new Italian government feared that fascist loyalists might try to turn his grave into a shrine. But the silence didn't last. In 1946, less than a year after his death, Mussolini's body vanished. A group of neo-fascists managed to locate and steal the remains, setting off a nationwide search that embarrassed the authorities. For months, the dictator's body was hidden and moved between safe houses by sympathizers who claimed they were protecting his memory. The theft became a strange echo of the cult of personality that had surrounded Mussolini in life. Even in death, he stirred devotion and division. Eventually, the authorities recovered the body. To prevent another incident, it was hidden in various secret locations, including monasteries, until the situation in post-war Italy stabilized. More than a decade later, in 1957, the government finally agreed to release the remains to Mussolini's widow. They were reburied in the Mussolini family crypt in his birthplace, Predappio, a small town in northern Italy. There, the site became a point of pilgrimage for the remaining supporters of fascism. For the rest of Italy, however, the image that stayed etched in memory was not the crypt in Predappio, but the site of Piazzale Loreto. The square became one of the most powerful symbols of the end of fascism, the moment when a dictator's myth collapsed in full view of the people he had ruled. Yet, even this moment caused debate. Some believed the public display was necessary, a way for Italy to confront the reality of its past and finally move on. Others felt it crossed the line, arguing that Mussolini should have faced a trial instead of being executed and humiliated. The discussion about how to treat Mussolini's remains never truly ended. His cult of personality had been so deeply ingrained that even his corpse became a contested symbol. Historians noted that despite the damage and mutilation, many Italians could still recognize him in the photographs. In a way, that recognition symbolized how deeply his image had been burned into the nation's collective memory. Beyond Italy, Mussolini's death had ripple effects across the crumbling Axis powers. Some historians believe that Adolf Hitler, seeing what had happened to his former ally, decided to avoid a similar fate. Just 2 days after Mussolini's execution, Hitler took his own life in Berlin, ensuring there would be no public display, desecration, and no capture. The difference between the two endings showed the rapid collapse of a world order built on fear and domination. Critical notes, uncertainties, and historiographical debate. Even though the events of April 28, 1945, are among the most documented of Mussolini's life, many details about his final moments remain uncertain. Historians, journalists, and even those who were there have never fully agreed on exactly what happened in that quiet corner near Lake Como. For example, there is still debate about who actually fired the fatal shots. Walter Audicio claimed for years that he carried out the execution himself, using a borrowed submachine gun that jammed before he switched weapons. Yet other witnesses insisted that another partisan fired first, or that several opened fire at once. Some reports say the gun jammed, while others deny that ever happened. These inconsistencies have turned the execution into one of the most disputed episodes of Italy's final wartime days. The question of whether Mussolini should have been given a formal trial has also divided opinion. Some argue that summary execution was necessary because Italy was collapsing. Partisan groups were acting independently, and any delay might have caused more conflict or an attempt at rescue. Others believe a trial, even a brief one, would have served justice better and avoided the chaos that followed. When it comes to understanding what truly happened, historians face a challenge. Eyewitness reports, such as those published in Time or described by journalist Reg Ingraham, differ sharply from partisan memoirs written after the war, especially Audicio's own accounts. Later historians have tried to piece together the truth by comparing these versions, but biases, fading memories, and political motives all complicate the picture. Some of the confusion can also be traced to myth-making. In the decades that followed, both sides, anti-fascists and Mussolini sympathizers, built the story to fit their own narratives. For one group, his end symbolized justice and liberation. For the other, it became a tale of betrayal and martyrdom. But the real question is, did Mussolini deserve what he got? And at what point does justice start to look like the cruelty it condemns? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen